This week we'll be covering phonetics, phonology, and speech sound disorders. This is basically a review of your phonetics coursework, which you've covered. There should not be an introduction of new topics, but if there are, then we will go into depth for that. But most of this information should already be familiar to you. So going back, thinking about how articulation is produced, we have resonance, phonation, articulation. So speech production is a mechanism. We have phonetics and phonetic transcription for transcribing sounds. We have the phoneme classification system of how we classify different phonemes. Within this, we have the dynamics of co-articulation in speech production, meaning that when we say sounds in connected speech, when we're speaking to each other, the sounds are influenced by the surrounding phonemes, and we will discuss that further regarding allophonic variations. We have specific phonological rules that we must follow, sometimes referred to as phonological processes, and there is a distinction between articulation and phonology. So here is an illustration picking up from where we left off last week, just graphing how speech works. We develop the ideas in our brain, our motivation, our language regulation. Within the upper vocal tract, we have articulation and resonance. Right below, in the lower part of the upper vocal tract, we have our vocal folds causing vibration, and all of this is powered by the respiratory system, which activates the vocal folds. So again, what is speech? It's the direct result of muscle contractions innervated by the nervous system, which move structures in ways that force air out of the lungs, vibrate that air, resonate it, and break it into speech sounds, which is a result of successive and simultaneous, continuous, and synchronized interaction of these systems. Nothing is working in isolation. Everything must be working properly, and if something is not working properly, then we have possible speech sound disorders or speech errors. So, when we consider the articulatory phonetic system, speech sounds are produced by the structures that are part of the vegetative system. That is the system that we're not necessarily controlling with our brain. They're automatic systems, automatic processing, such as breathing. It is perceived by the auditory mechanism. It is described in symbol units, such as the sounds are a unit for words, and then we also have our phonetic transcription units as a symbol. When we're talking about symbols, when we label something with a name, a given word, let's take for instance cat, and then somehow, somewhere along the way, someone has strung the sounds of k, at together to make the word cat and give that symbol to that entity that a cat is. We can see commonalities amongst languages for certain words and symbols, such as mama and dada. These are some of the earliest developing phonemes, and it's very common across languages that the symbols for mother and father have the reduplication of the m or d phonemes. The articulatory phonetic system is also learned, meaning you have to hear speech in order to develop speech, and it is influenced by forces that produce variation. So let's look at the PH words. I call them the PH words because they have that common start with the sound, and the common root is phone, and phone means sound, and that's phone like P-H-O-N. It's a Latin root. And I'm going to reference roots a lot as we progress through this course, because your knowledge of root words, is, in addition to prefixes and suffixes, should facilitate your understanding of this terminology. So again, phone is the root of these words. It means sound. So phonology is the study of speech sounds, sound production, and rules for combining sounds into meaningful words and sentences. All right, so the key here is that the ology part of phonology means study of. When you're in linguistics and you talk about morphology, that's the study of morphemes. So that's a very important component of how you can distinguish between phonology, which is the study of speech sounds, versus phonetics, is the study of speech sounds, production, and acoustic properties, and written symbols representing them. So phonetics has to do with the written component of speech and how we transcribe those sounds. So how do phonetics and speech sound disorders go together? It's the study of the physical, psychological, and acoustic variables of speech sound production and includes the acoustic, articulatory, experimental, and clinical branches. So again, you can see these PH root, the phone root in the words phoneme, allophones, and morphemes. A phoneme is a family of speech sounds, members of which are perceived as belonging to the same class, such as t and d are both stop sounds produced on the alveolar ridge. Now, an allophone is a variation of a phoneme that do not signal a difference in meaning. So an instance here is that if we say the word cat and then we say the word can, although phonetically speaking, the a in the middle is the same sound, there is a distinct difference between cat and can sounds because the a in can is influenced by the nasal consonant. So what happens when we produce can is that the tongue begins to move towards the placement for an sound and the velopharyngeal flap, which is closed during most consonant productions, begins to open on the vowel production to allow us to get the nasalization for the sound. So practice saying that yourself as you're listening to the lecture. Cat, can. Very different sounds, although technically they're the same a phoneme. The next word is morpheme. And morphemes are important because they're the smallest meaningful units of words. They may be sounds or words, but they make a difference in meaning. So if we say a, that alone does not stand by itself, but the word cat or can is a morpheme. If we said a is a single sound. It can stand alone and it has meaning because we know a is an article that we attach to words like a cat or a can. So here are several important terms. These will be important for you to know the distinct differences between these. A phone is the actual sound produced by the vocal tract. So that could be as simple as ah. A phoneme is the smallest non-meaningful perceptible unit of oral language. An allophone is a slight variation in the production of a phoneme in the context that do not change meaning. Again, cat and can is a good example of what's often called allophonic variation. A morpheme is the smallest meaningful unit of language in a particular language. This is across languages. All languages have morphemes. Now, there are two distinct types of morphemes, free morphemes and bound morphemes. Free morphemes, as the name free implies, can stand alone and designate meaning. So cat, by itself, is a free morpheme. If I were to say cats, as in plural, then I now have a word with two distinct morphemic units because I have attached a bound morpheme of s to the word cats. Bound morphemes are word endings or beginnings that alter the meaning of words. So these are prefixes and suffixes, but they cannot stand alone. So ing and walking is an example of a bound morpheme. Plural s, possessive s. There are many, many examples of bound morphemes, and we attach them to free morphemes in order to carry meaning. Bound morphemes cannot carry meaning independently. And the last important term I want you to be aware of are minimal pairs, which are morphemes that are similar except for one phoneme. And an example of a minimal pair would be cat and can, because the only difference between those two words are n and t. We talk about minimal pairs a good bit in speech sound disorders because this is often a way to target speech sound production. For instance, with children that I work with that have R errors, I'm doing minimal pair contrast for words like wed and red so they can hear the difference. Or top and stop. Another example might be date and gate. Very similar words with only one sound difference. So think back to your phonetics course and your phonetic transcription. To transcribe words, we use the International Phonetic Alphabet, or IPA, because it better represents phonemes than the traditional alphabets. And as you know, English has 26 letters, but 44 to 46, depending on which version you're looking at, distinct sounds. So we have more distinct sounds than we have letters. So oftentimes in English, a distinct sound is represented by 2 or even 3 letters, sometimes strung together. An example would be CH for the sound ch. In contrast, the International Phonetic Alphabet, or IPA system, has one symbol for the ch sound. SLPs master the IPA symbols to transcribe the speech samples of children with speech sound disorders. Abstract phonemes are enclosed in virgules, such as the independent here, and the actual productions or allophones are in brackets. Categorical IPA symbols may not capture all the varieties of speech sound errors children produce, so sometimes you might have to use diacritical markers to indicate that the child is producing a lateral S or a frontal S sound. Now for practice, I would like for you to transcribe these words as I say them, and I admit to having a little bit of nasal congestion as I'm filming this, so I might even have a little bit of hyponasality on some of the words with nasal sounds. So if you need a refresher for your phonetic symbols, it can be found in Table 3.1 on pages 66 to 67, and page 67 includes the diacritical markers to indicate the various allophonic variations. So transcribe these words. Telephone, window, chicken, yellow, pencils, bathtub, jumping, pajamas, vacuum, scissors. Now that you have practiced transcribing, we'll move on to the dynamics of speech production. Speech production is an aerodynamic process. Air is working together dynamically with all of the other features of the muscular system to produce speech sounds. So the dynamics of speech production include the aerodynamic, acoustic, suprasegmental, and co-articulation variables. And again, co-articulation and allophonic variation, I gave you that example of cat, can. Co-articulation is when words that are phonemes that are near each other are influenced by the surrounding phoneme. So the a being influenced by the nasalization of the n sound. The aerodynamic aspects include the buildup of the subglottic air pressure that blows the vocal folds apart and causes them to vibrate. The air pressure also may be built up in the oral cavity to produce pressure consonants. And again, this is all a review from your AAP course, and we discussed it last week. Intraoral air pressure is minimal in producing vowels because vowels are completely open productions of sound, so you don't need a lot of pressure to produce it. In contrast, if we're producing some of the stop or plosive sounds, you're going to have a lot of air pressure build up prior to the release of that air to produce that sound. Speech sounds are acoustic signals with the physical properties of frequency, amplitude, and duration. Frequency is the rate at which vocal folds vibrate, causing the sensation of vocal pitch. The amplitude or intensity is the magnitude of the vibration, causing the sensation of loudness. We often measure amplitude in decibels versus frequency is measured in hertz. The duration is the measure of time during which vibrations are sustained. And this is all a review from your introduction to speech class. Study the text to understand how these variables make a difference in speech sounds. The suprasegmental properties. Suprasegmental properties are basically your tone, your pitch, your intonation, your rate of speech. So some individuals may speak in a monotone with no inflection, and suprasegmentals also indicate if we're asking a question or if we're making a statement by raising and falling pitches at various points in our sentences to indicate if it's a statement, a question, or an explanation. So a lot of speech is communicated in suprasegmental features. This is one feature we lose in the process of communicating either through text or written form, email. Anytime that it's a written form, we don't have tone, so we represent suprasegmental speech through our punctuation. We use commas, we use periods, we use exclamation points. But this is something you can think about whenever you get a text or an email from someone, and maybe the tone of the text seems abrupt or rude. It's because you don't have those suprasegmental features of pitch and rate and tone of speech to understand what the intent of the communicator is. Again, oftentimes we're doing that in text message and it's really quick, and we don't have the time to rewrite and reread to make sure that we're communicating with the intended tone of what we thought. So it's a very important feature of speech sound production. The segmentals are consonants and vowels, and the suprasegmentals include prosodic features such as pitch, stress, rate of speech, and juncture. Rising and falling pitch and variable stress in certain syllables can signal differences in meaning. Another thing that's communicated very clearly through suprasegmentals is sarcasm. So, yeah, you look great in that, versus, yeah, you look great in that, are two very different messages. Faster or slower rate of speech may affect prosody and intelligibility. Intelligibility is how well you are understood. It doesn't have to do with intelligence or IQ. It's how well someone understands what you are saying. If you're faster or slower, you may not be as intelligible to the listener as you would be if you were using a typical rate of speech. I try to be very intentional when I'm recording these lectures to speak at a slower rate because I normally have a pretty fast rate of speaking in everyday conversation. Again, prosody is that up and down tone of our voice when we go higher or lower pitched. And we also see that children with language disorders or children with that are on the autism spectrum have difficulty with suprasegmentals of speech. So they may not have speech sound errors, but they may need to be taught, or their awareness of prosody and intonation might need to be targeted in speech intervention, because the way the brain works and where the suprasegmental features are processed just seems to be an area of deficiency for our children who have linguistic deficits and language deficits. Finally, juncture, or a pause in your speech, helps make semantic or grammatical distinctions in speech. So co-articulation, I already mentioned this a little bit before. Co, together, and our speech sounds are influencing each other, and we're influencing by the surrounding phonemes. One phoneme is influenced by the phonemes that are surrounding it. So sounds are more distinct in isolated and deliberate production of a word. So it's more distinct to say k than it is to say cat. In connected speech, sounds may be less distinct or may even change their form due to the effect of co-articulation. An example of this would be the flap sound. So if I say ladder, like I climbed the ladder, or if I say letter, I need to write a letter. The t and d sounds in ladder and letter sound very similar because of co-articulation is losing the distinctness in order to glide into that rhotic sound at the end of the word. So co-articulation is the slight or significant change in sounds due to the influence of surrounding sounds and utterance. In co-articulation, we have overlapping articulatory gestures. We have adaptation, which does not create a perceptual change, and assimilation, which has audible characteristics that affect change. The book has several examples of co-articulation influence and how these sounds can sound different depending on the surrounding vowels or other phonemes. So it uses the example of this and soup versus sink and how the sounds different in those two words. The bilabial and stop sounds, rather, the stops and plosives are usually some of the best examples of how they can sound different because sometimes we get more or less air depending on the vowel we're moving to. So the example the book gives is tin versus took. The t in took is stronger than the tin in the t in tin because of where the vowel is happening in the word. So when we have assimilation, then the sounds are so distinctly different that it's very evident that that's not the word the child or the adult even is trying to produce. An example the book gives is computer for computer. And assimilation is a phonological process that we will discuss in the second video series of this lecture. So when we are evaluating children and when we are discussing speech sound disorders, we want to take a speech sound inventory. Now, a complete and fully developed speech sound system will have all of the sounds of the English language fully developed. So in American English, we have 24 consonants, 14 vowels, and 6 diphthongs. Phonemic contrasts make a difference in meaning, as we talked about with minimal pairs, and I used the example of cat versus can. Each language has an inventory of sounds, so every language is going to have a different number of sounds. Even within English language, we have American English variations from British English or Australian English. An example of this is the rhotic R sound, or commonly the ers, ors, rs, which are not produced in other variations of English, but are American English sounds. It's estimated that some 100 phonemes are used in the language of the world, and that in English, again, the book is defining it as 44 sounds in the American English language. And where you get some distinct arguments about is it 44 or 46 has to do with those liquid sounds, the l and sounds and the variations between those. Allophonic variations create different dialects of a language. So most of you are probably Southern American English speaking, as I am, and that's going to sound different than Standard American English, and it's going to sound different than someone who's living in the northeastern United States, such as Boston. So we might say Boston, but they might say Boston, or even just drive 2 hours south of me and go to New Orleans, and you have a different variation of American English because you have the New Orleans Yat accent, which has a lot of differences in the vowelized R's, such as quota for quarter. So we have about 13 distinct dialects within the United States, and you learn more about that throughout the rest of your coursework as well. And we will have a discussion of that later in the semester. So morphophonemics and phonotactics. Remember I said I would talk about root words and prefixes and suffixes. So you see morpho, that's coming from morphemes or morphology, and morph means to change. Remember, if we add a bound morpheme to a free morpheme, we're going to change the meaning in this example of book by adding an S. It moves from the meaning of one book to 2 books. So because of this, we end up having changes in the way words and sounds are produced because of the morphophonemic variation. So phonemic is the sound, and morpho means to change. So morphophonemic rules specify how sounds are combined to form morphemes. Morphemes may be added to free morphemes to change the meaning, but if you have an S at the end of the word added, Whether it is a voiceless S, s, or a voiced S, z, is going to depend on the consonant that it is attached to. So voicing morphemic rule is another example. The plural S may be unvoiced or voiced in words that end with unvoiced or voiced sounds. So in the example book, books, the S is still unvoiced because the k is unvoiced. But if the word was hug and I put an S on the end of hug, it becomes hugs, and that's a z sound, a voiced S sound, because the g at the end of hug is voiced. So this is important for academic considerations for children with speech sound disorders and typically developing children, because this can explain why sometimes a child might spell bees, B-E-E-Z, instead of B-E-E-S. As a fluent speller of the English language, you know that the Z sound as a plural is always represented by S, but children don't necessarily know that. They're just spelling how they sound. They hear the words, the way the words sound. Phonotactic rules specify sound combinations typical of different languages. So when we're thinking about sounds and how sounds are produced in connected speech, there are lots of influences on how we produce phonemes in connected speech. We can conduct a phonological analysis. An inventory of the phonemes in a particular language is a phonemic inventory. And for us in English language, we're using the IPA. The description of the patterns of the use of these phonemes is known as phonotactics. The description of the phonemes as produced in various phonetic contexts are known as allophonic variations. And then the description of the morphophonemic alternation that changes in sound patterns is known as morphophonemics. And again, you can see that root of phone, meaning sound, in all of those words. So phonemes are classified by how they're produced. They're produced by some narrowing or closing of the vocal tract for consonant sounds. Phonemes produced by relatively open vocal tracts are usually vowels and then a few of our consonants. And the sounds may be made quickly by gliding to simple vowels. So this is how we can consider phoneme classification. Consonant vowels are the two main categories. We also have diphthongs that are like vowels. In English, they are only vowels, but they are produced a little differently than just vowels alone. Clusters are consonants produced in side-by-side combination, and they may be prevocalic or postvocalic. So the clusters we typically use in the English language are S blends, L blends, and R blends. So any consonant attached to S, any consonant attached to L, or any consonant attached to R. Think about R, we have break and green and dream. For L, we have glass and slide and black. And then for S, we have stop and smile and spot and ski. So those are the combinations. Those are the prevocalic cluster examples. A postvocalic cluster might be an S blend at the end of the word, or even when we have the X sound is actually X, where we have a K and an S sound attached together. That's not technically what we would call them, but it is the X sound. So vowels are produced with an open vocal tract all the time. We have monophthongs, which are single vowels, but diphthongs are two vowels produced with a quick gliding movement. And examples of this are ow, oi, and we'll get into those in a minute. So we also have phoneme classification as consonant vowels and syllables. Consonants may be prevocalic, which is the initial position of the word or the beginning, intervocalic or medial, happening in the middle of the word, and postvocalic or final, which happens at the end of the word. Consonants initiate syllables, But vowels are the nucleus of the syllable, meaning that the vowel is what the nucleus is, where everything's happening around it. And the nucleus is the syllable. Now, we often have to classify words by syllables, and you cannot have a syllable without a vowel sound. They do not exist. Syllables may be open or closed. Open meaning that they end with a vowel sound, and if they are closed, they end with a consonant sound. So an example of this would be open, B, versus close, beep. Consonants release or arrest syllables, and a syllable also has an onset and a coda. The nucleus and coda are collectively known as the rhyme, and this is also something significant for speech sound development and academic and literacy development, because we have onset rhyme. Onset is everything that happens before the vowel, and the rhyme is the nucleus of the coda, which is the vowel and everything attached after it. So we might have k, at for cat. K is the onset, at is the rhyme. And you may notice that that sounds like rhyming words, and that's exactly what rhyming words are. Rhyming words are words that have the same nucleus and coda. So we can use the example of at words: cat, bat, mat, rat, hat. This is a very important pre-academic linguistic skill for children to have in order to be able to read adequately. So, some more on symbols. A consonant or a cluster initiates the syllable, which is the onset. The rhyme is what follows the onset, and the final consonant is the coda. So in the word break, the cluster br is the onset, the diphthong a is the nucleus, and the final k is the coda. The diphthong a and the final k make up the rhyme. So if I wanted to think of a word that rhymed with break, it might be cake or bake or make. English words don't always follow this pattern. So words may begin and end with a vowel, such as eat, act, you, be, etc. And if you see in this example, you and be are examples of open syllables, versus eat and act are examples of closed syllables because they end with a consonant. And you can disregard this slide. So, consonant production. What categories are used for classifying consonants? These include place, manner, and voice. The manner of articulation is how we produce these sounds. The place of articulation is where they're being produced within the oral cavity. And the voice is laryngeal activity, whether the vocal folds are vibrating or not. So we have, in voice, we only have two categories: voiced or voiceless sounds. The degree of vocal tract constriction is also involved, as well as the tension of the speech musculature. So consonants are always classified by place, manner, and voice. In regards to the manner of articulation, this refers to how the airstream that passes through the vocal tract is modified to produce consonants. The manner-based classification of consonants yields stops, fricatives, affricates, nasals, glides, and liquids. This includes all of the ways we can produce consonants in English. Such a knowledge is essential to teaching speech sound disorders in children with speech sound disorders, because we must know how these are articulated in order to teach them the correct placement, in order to also distinguish between sounds and understand how the child is substituting one sound for another. So, in regards to place of articulation, it refers to location in the vocal tract where the articulators contact and constrict the place to produce consonants. So, the place of articulation in the English language for consonants includes bilabial. Bi means to or between. These are the lip sounds, because labial means lip. Labiodental, that is a combination of the lips and teeth. Linguodental, which is the combination of the tongue and teeth, also known as interdental sounds. Lingual alveolar, which is the combination of the tongue and the alveolar ridge. Lingual palatal sounds, which is a combination of the tongue and the palate. And lingual velar sounds, which is a combination of the tongue and the velum. And finally, glottal sounds, which are really more open sounds happening along the glottal tract. This classification is based on the primary articulators that make contact, which include the lips, teeth, tongue, and the palates. And also we have some jaw, mandible control within those placements as well. Sometimes your jaw is more open, sometimes it is more closed. Finally, consonant voicing. The voice feature is the result of the vibrations of the vocal folds. Voice sounds produced with vocal fold vibrations, and unvoiced sounds are produced without such vibrations. So at this time, I would like you to take a moment to list the voice sounds of English and the voiceless sounds. Remember, there are 24 consonants in the English language. So now that you took a moment to complete that exercise, here is a diagram of consonants. This is from Letters, the Language Essentials for Teachers of Reading and Spelling, Module 2. The State Department of Education in Mississippi has been spending some time the past few years to train teachers on these particular aspects of phonology in order to enhance teacher understanding of literacy development and how children spell certain words. Again, I gave you that example of when a child spells bees, B-E-E-Z, it's because they hear the Z at the end of bees. So sometimes we can understand children's substitution of sounds when we have a better understanding of place, manner, and voicing. So this is one diagram. Table 3.3 on page 75 in your textbook has all of the phonemes listed and whether they are and with their voicing, manner, and place. You can see the only lip sounds are these three, 2 stops and 1 nasal. The teeth lip sounds, which are those lingua dental sounds, are the f and v sounds. The interdental sounds are the th and v sounds. The lingual alveolar are the most consonants in our English language, and you can see those here. The lingual palatal sounds are here, and sh and j, ch and j and y. This j sound we do not produce very much. Generally in American English, but especially in the South, we are not generally saying measure or garage. So that might be a sound that is not in the speech sound repertoire of an adult speaker of Southern American English. The lingua velar or back sounds are here, and then the glottal sound, the only glottal sound in the English language, is the h sound. Here's another diagram, basically saying the same thing for your reference. And also this is place at the top, and manner, how we're producing stops or plosives. We stop the air and then release it. The nasals are produced with the velopharyngeal flap open, so the air is flowing through the nasal cavity. The fricatives are airflow sounds, so you can have them flow indefinitely. They're you can hold them indefinitely, so you can hold as long as you're holding your breath. The affricates are somewhat of a combination of a stop and a fricative. So initially you stop the air and then release it quickly for ch and j. And if you do those sounds, you can contrast ch versus sh. Sh you can hold indefinitely or as long as you have air, but ch you can't hold for an extended period of time. But it's not as strong of a stop as t, t. There's a little bit more air produced on the ch sound. The glides glide over the tongue, and then the liquids, often these are the two that are some of the later developing sounds and some of the hardest to produce. And with the r sound, we have 2 different ways we can produce that with our tongue in the English language. So, what characterizes stop consonants and the placement and voicing features of each? Stops, the airstream is completely obstructed momentarily in the vocal tract. The air is sometimes released suddenly with a burst of noise. The movements involved are rapid, resulting in sounds of the shortest duration. Again, you can't hold them very long, they're the quick sounds. So, three places of closure may occur: bilabial, alveolar, and velar. And they can be voiced or voiceless. So here are the stop sounds. P, b, t, d, k, g. Give yourself an opportunity to say those and feel the contrast between the two, or rather 6. What's characteristic of the fricative sounds? In fricatives, airstream passes through a narrow opening so that the breath is only partially blocked. Airflow produces a frication noise. The velopharyngeal port is closed. And you have the most options for the places of constriction: the lip and teeth, the tongue teeth, the glottis, the tongue tip alveolar ridge, the tongue hard palate, and they may be voiced or voiceless. So again, practice these sounds as we go through them for the fricatives. F, v, f, v, sh, j, s, z. What characterizes the affricate consonants and what are the place and voicing of each? The production begins with an obstructed airstream, a stop, and ends with its quick release, a fricative. The velopharyngeal port is closed. Placement of the tongue tip and blade at the alveolar ridge is the point of constriction, and they may be voiced or voiceless. So the only two sounds in English are ch and j. And what characterizes the nasal consonants and what are the place features of each? The oral tract is closed and the velopharyngeal port is opened. Resonance occurs in the nasal, oral, and pharyngeal cavities. And again, I'm a little congested, so I might not have a strong resonance as normal through my nasal cavity for these nasal sounds. Obstruction of the airflow is through the oral cavity or the vocal tract is complete. There are semivowels and they're all voiced. There are no voiceless nasal consonants. So, The glide consonants. In English, there are 2 glide consonants are considered on glides, which means they're always prevocalic, occur only in the word initial and word medial positions. A word can never end with these sounds. They're produced by the glide motion of the articulators with a closed velopharyngeal port and a more open oral cavity than during production of consonants. Constriction occurs with contact of the tongue blade against the hard palate. Obstruction is by rounded lips and tongue elevated to the velum. They are semivocalic or semivowels, and they are voiced. So, woo and y. The liquid consonants production is similar to glides with obstruction slightly more than for vowels. The velopharyngeal port is closed and the oral articulatory postures are sustained. They are also semivowel and they are also voiced. So we have the sounds l and r. And again, as a refresher, the place of articulation. Bilabials, which means with the lips. Labiodentals, which are the lips and teeth. Linguadentals, tongue and teeth. Lingualveolars, tongue and alveolar ridge. Linguapalatals, tongue and palate. Linguavelars, tongue and the velum, or back of the mouth. That's the k and the g sounds, and the glottals. Now, distinctive features are another way of classifying sounds. This was developed by Chomsky and Hall, and it's an articulatory or acoustic characteristic that is either present or absent in a phoneme. Each phoneme is described in terms of a binary system, so a two-fold system. It's either a plus or a minus, plus for the presence of something, and a minus for the absence of a feature. The feature concept is part of the newer non-lineal phonological theories, so this is theoretically driven, and it's a different way to classify sounds, but the way we traditionally classify sounds in place, manner, voicing can still fit into the distinctive features up to a certain point. So the distinctive features are sibilant, approximate, rhotic, and syllabics. So a sibilant feature is high-frequency sound with more strident quality and longer duration. These include the fricatives and the affricates. So think about they're the hold sounds that you can hold for longer periods of time. S is a sibilant. An approximate feature is a constant produced by approximate contact, and this includes the glides and the liquids. So the w sound and the r sound and the l sound. The rhotics, and I've mentioned the word rhotic several times before, are indicators of R coloring, meaning that R is influencing the way this sound is produced. So R, air, And finally, the syllabics are all vowels. They are syllabic consonants, the nasals and the liquids. So here is a chart of the distinctive features. And you can see how they're classified there. You also have a chart on a table 3.5 on page 82 of your manual, of your textbook rather. So again, it's just another way of describing how these speech sounds are produced. So most distinctive features have manner, place, and voicing counterparts. So the sonorants features is unimpeded airstream. These are always all the vowels. The strident and continuant features are fricatives. The interrupted feature are the stops because you're interrupting the airflow. The obstruent feature is complete closure or narrow constriction in the oral cavity, which include the stops, fricatives, and affricates. And again, here is another illustration for you to see how place, voice, and manner can be linked to distinctive features. And this will conclude the first part of your lecture for Chapter 3.